For this week's discussion, we're talking about flipped classrooms. And before I get into the specific questions that we're answering, I think it's interesting as you think about flipped classrooms to think about how in some content, the flipped classroom concept has actually been around a lot longer, just not necessarily considered to be a flipped classroom in the way we think about it now. When we say flipped classroom, we think about video recordings that students are viewing prior to arriving in class. But um, having come through and my undergrad and my master's degree, both being in English, I experienced plenty of flipped classrooms where all of the reading took place prior to entering into the classroom, where then the activities were to engage with the text, do the analysis of the text, explore the themes in it, and enter into that larger discussion. So, applying some of that content knowledge after having read it or read the introduction in the chapter or read those pieces. But for the most part, as we start to dig into the literature today about flipped classrooms, it relates more to that video capture aspect of it. And so question number one was very simply, does flipped classroom work for all ages and all types of learners? I think the short answer is it can, but the research suggests that it doesn't necessarily work for all. And so in the TED Talk that was in the beginning of this particular part of our module, she talks about how it's not a cure-all. It didn't fix everybody who wasn't engaged, but it did help her see some gains. In this particular article about lecture capture and thinking about flipping or not flipping, ultimately, when you get down into their results from the research and them exploring what's already been done in this field, it's a mixed bag. Moving over, and this is the impact of flipped classroom on students. I think it highlights some of the really beneficial aspects. If you've ever sat in that class where you're trying desperately to get all the notes down during a lecture, and you know that there's no way to go back to it. If you missed it, you missed it. As opposed to a flipped model where I can stop it, I can pause it, I can rewind, I can maybe put it a little bit faster to listen to it and get through as I'm taking my notes or doing whatever it is I've been asked to do to engage in the content. So students see it, as a safety net in a lot of ways to be able to return to it. But the downside, and I think it's mentioned in this one, talks about how ultimately, though, students like to be in the classroom during the lecture piece of it, and they tend to report that one of the reasons for that is to be able to ask questions and clarify information in that moment. So we talk about K-12 setting. Oftentimes, you're going to see this model being used more with older students, middle school, high school age, as opposed to younger elementary school students. It doesn't mean it can't work with them. I thought it was interesting that during the pandemic, my elementary age children were given iPads, and a lot of their stuff was on Canvas, and they got really good at navigating and clicking on the videos and watching the things they had to do and completing the tasks. And the minute they returned to the building, all those iPads were collected back up. And the students no longer had access to those resources and tools, and we were back to kind of the old model. This article, and I've zeroed in on one of the tables because I think this is interesting too when we're talking about whether it's effective for all. They did a study looking at, it was more of a meta-analysis, and as they looked at it, for K-12, you had a lower percentage that found significance in the flipped classrooms, and it was focused on science and math classes. And post-secondary, those numbers go up. And it would suggest that perhaps in certain areas, it's a little bit more beneficial, and perhaps it works a little bit better. So as far as examples of flipped classroom, I think to some extent, as I started to play around, this in and of itself is a tool that during the pandemic, we all started playing with and getting better and better. And I know quite a few teachers who are still using Zoom. Some of my classroom teachers are actually using the videos that they recorded while they were in remote learning. They load them back into their Canvas course now with their face-to-face students as a resource for students to return to. Um, and one that I wanted to pull up and highlight um, is John Green and the crash courses. For high school students especially, it does a really good job of providing the content in a way that is palatable to students, and in those short 10 minutes or less usually video sequences. And then you can do some application when the students appear in the class. As far as tools, obviously the Zoom that I'm using, I mean, you can shoot the video on just about anything. I work on a MacBook on my personal device, and I've used Screencast-O-Matic. I've used just QuickTime has a capture option on it. Another option that I think is useful, and I don't know if it's going to load here, but Flipgrid, which allows you to create a video introduction. So you could actually, if you were to create a topic for your students, when you get down into this part about the topic media, you can actually use the web-based software to record a video. And in that video, you could give the instruction, or you could record, the lecture essentially. And then it gives you the option to have students then do some response in it, even prior to coming back into the classroom, depending on what that looks like. Another tool that I'm partial to is Edpuzzle. Edpuzzle allows you to both use things that are out there, and there are some that are already created, like this was already created for how to solve one-step equations. And you can embed into it different questions. And so you can actually have the video stop. Students have to, in this case, it says grab their whiteboard materials or notebook and pencil, and then follow along as they go through and they're working on the problems. So you can record your own video, upload it into Edpuzzle, stop your video at certain points where you want them to interact with each other or interact with the content. So as far as flipping it and still having it interactive on that side, there's a lot of possibilities with that particular tool as well. But overall, looking at the research around whether or not it works or it doesn't, it is very mixed, but there's a lot of really positive results. I think the one piece that's sometimes missing plays into that idea of motivation and whether or not your students are motivated to do the work. I worked with a really, really talented math teacher who flipped her classroom, and the biggest issue that she had were those students who simply weren't motivated enough to actually watch the videos before they got to class. And she had all these interactive and application, and not just, doing the homework and the practice while you were there and you could get help, but actually applying it in more ways than just the problems. But she had probably a third of every class that didn't engage or couldn't engage at that point because they hadn't seen the videos. And so thinking through how you overcome that becomes another side of dealing with the flipped classroom, and whether or not it's beneficial and whether or not everything could or should be flipped. You go back to some of the research that suggests that students don't necessarily want to receive some of the information through a video format or through a reading prior to. They want to be able to have a more interactive experience. And I think that that's where some things like Flipgrid and Edpuzzle add another layer to it, where it can be a little more interactive. But ultimately, it's definitely a model that could be incorporated and a model that could be beneficial. And again, some of it is going to go back to the teacher, and it's going to go back to the students in that room. So whether or not it works for each teacher, whether the teacher is ready, there were a lot of research articles that actually talk just about that. What is the readiness level of a teacher to actually flip a classroom? And so depending on where the teacher is, depending on how students have been prepped for it, All of those things can factor into whether or not it actually produces better outcomes for students.